All right, deep divers, get ready, because today we're really diving deep, like across continents and generations deep with this one.
Yeah, definitely a journey.
You guys share this excerpt from Sansari, from South Asia to South America to North America. And wow, this woman's life. Talk about a crash course in migration patterns.
It's incredible, isn't it? How one person's story can give us this new perspective on these global shifts. Sansari's experience is like a textbook example of twice migration, when someone is forced to relocate multiple times, not by choice, but by circumstances, things beyond their control.
Twice migration. So it's not just about like moving somewhere once because there's a great opportunity. This is being pushed and pulled all over the globe, sometimes even for generations. What really got me was how Sansari's family story began. Late 1800s, British Guiana, sugar plantations. It's a world away from where their story ends up.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's a world built on a system that was designed to create divisions. Over 200,000 indentured laborers were taken to Guyana from South Asia, many trying to escape poverty, just like Sansari's parents.
Huh.
But instead, they were thrown into this system of brutal labor, this strict social hierarchy,
What?
all very carefully designed by
The British, right?
exactly the British.
It's one thing to read about those historical systems, but to think about Sansari's parents being thrust into that. The chapter mentioned they didn't even speak English or the local Creole language. I can't imagine how they were supposed to assimilate even if they wanted to.
And you've hit on a crucial point. This racialization, as scholars call it, creating these divisions was a deliberate strategy by the British to maintain their control. It limited opportunities for anyone who wasn't European. Even the language used at the time, like the term coolie, it was used to dehumanize and categorize. So Sansari's parents, despite living these transnational lives, they were stuck. They had very few opportunities to blend in.
So they held on to their traditions, their languages, almost like a shield against this new world. It makes you think about the amount of strength it must have taken to build a life when the whole system seems designed to keep them on the outside.
Absolutely. And it's in this context that we meet Sansari, born in 1904.
I see.
Can you imagine? Growing up surrounded by this really interesting blend of South Asian traditions clashing with Guyanese Creole culture.
It's like a cultural collision, but then also this really unique fusion too, right? So did that create conflict, or was it more of a shared identity for her generation?
It's complicated. But what we can see in the excerpt is that these larger forces at play, like in this case, a shortage of women in the South Asian community, they end up having huge social consequences.
Fewer women making the journey. That couldn't have helped with gender equality.
Sadly, no. It only reinforced the patriarchal structures that already existed within South Asian culture. And it led to practices like child marriages and even multiple marriages.
Oh.
And in Sansari's life, her two marriages really stood out to me. One when she was just a child and then another at 12 after she was widowed. It gives you a glimpse into the societal pressures, the limited choices women faced back then, a stark contrast from how we view marriage today.
For sure. It really shows how important context is. It's so easy to judge the past through our lens today. But Sansari's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes it was about survival, about navigating these social expectations that didn't really give people a lot of options. But, I mean, even with all those hardships, there's a story of resilience here, too. The chapter talks about how her children, her grandchildren, they started to experience this shift away from those plantations towards more economic mobility. What changed for them?
Well, one big change was language. Sansari's children, that third generation, they grew up fluent in both Creole and English. That opened up doors that had been closed to her parents. And they also inherited that incredible work ethic and entrepreneurial spirit from their family. And remember those social networks we talked about?
Yeah.
Those played a key role here, too.
Okay, so they've got the language skills, they've got the resilience, they've got this network they can tap into. That's a pretty powerful combination. Is that what led to what the excerpt called ethnic entrepreneurship?
Exactly. They started small, set up a cake shop right in their home, and then they used those skills passed down from their South Asian heritage and expanded into tailoring and retail. That classic story of immigrants building a life for themselves from scratch. They leveraged their cultural capital to create something new.
I love hearing about how they created that thriving family business. But the excerpt, it points out this really frustrating reality. Even with this success, even within the family itself, there are still those gender disparities. Sansari's sons inherited most of the wealth. It's like those patriarchal structures we talked about earlier. They just keep echoing down.
It really highlights how deeply ingrained those norms can be.
Yeah, it's disheartening.
Yeah.
And as if those challenges weren't enough, Sansari's family, along with the whole country really, get caught up in Guyana's struggle for independence.
Yeah, things are about to get even more complicated. We're talking Cold War era now, the time when those global power struggles were playing out in very real ways. What kind of impact did all of this have on Sansari and her family?
Well, Guyana's journey to becoming independent, it was really intertwined with these global forces. The People's National Congress, the PNC, came into power, and while they started as a pretty diverse party, they became more and more associated with Afro-Guyanese interests. They started enacting all these policies. And while they were presented as socialists, they often ended up having these unintended consequences that really hit the Indo-Guyanese community hard. So it's not even always about like outright discrimination, but about how even well-intentioned policies can still have a really negative impact on certain groups. It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Did this affect Sansari's family directly?
Oh, absolutely. The government put these huge restrictions on their ability to import goods for their business.
And that was their livelihood.
Exactly. They built their lives on these businesses, and suddenly the PNC's policies were throwing all these obstacles in their way. And it's not a coincidence that it was during this period that we see this new wave of migration out of Guyana. And Sansari and her family, they're eventually part of that wave.
It's like history is repeating itself. Sansari's parents, they fled hardship a generation earlier, and now her family, they're facing this whole new set of challenges that are forcing them to make these impossible choices. Do you think after all that work, all that effort, building a life in Guyana, did it feel like they were starting all over again? It's heartbreaking to think about having to rebuild your life, not even once, but twice. And Sansari's in her 80s by then. What makes her ultimately decide to leave Guyana?
Well, this is where those family connections we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
they really come full circle. See, one of Sansari's grandsons, he had already migrated to Canada.
Okay.
And he was able to sponsor his family,
Wow.
including his grandmother, Sansari. Speaks to the importance of family, those bonds, even across continents.
Yeah.
They can be really powerful.
Yeah. So in a way, she's kind of following the path laid out by those generations before her, seeking refuge, support within that family unit. But gosh, even still, that had to be such a difficult decision for her.
Of course, especially at that age. Can you imagine it? Leaving behind the only home you've ever known. The sights, the smells, the food. It's this mix of hope and heartbreak at the same time, this desire for a better life. But also leaving behind everything that's familiar. I think Sansari's twice migration, it really shows us just how bittersweet that reality can be.
It really makes you think about how these global events, they can have this ripple effect through time, impacting families for generations. I mean, her story starts with her parents escaping poverty in South Asia, and now here she is making another huge move in her 80s because of all this political and economic turmoil.
It's true. And I think it's a good reminder that these aren't just historical events we're talking about. They shape people's lives. Sansari's story, from those plantations all the way to her final days in Canada, it shows that history is lived experience. And for so many immigrant families, that experience is all about resilience, adaptation, and this constant search for belonging.
And it's a search that's still going on today, isn't it? All over the world, people making these really tough choices, leaving their loved ones, leaving their homelands, all because they're hoping for a better future. Sansari's story might be unique in its details, but that main thread, that's something that I think connects us all.
I agree. And it makes you wonder, how are the events that are happening today, how are those going to shape migration patterns in the future? And what will those stories teach us about the human spirit? How do we face these kinds of challenges?
Definitely something to think about. And on that note, we'll let you do just that. Until next time, deep divers, keep asking those big questions.